Hey guys, welcome back. So, tonight I want you to get comfortable. Dim the lights, find your blanket, pretend the emails don't exist, because we're going to take a nice, long, meandering drift through history. And yes, as always, it's going to be about royals who were frankly a mess. Now, the title of tonight's story is The Little Star Who Wanted to Shine, which sounds adorable. It sounds like a sweet children's book, maybe a tiny star trying its best among all the big, bright ones. But don't worry, we're not reading an actual nursery rhyme here. Instead, we're going to talk about historical people who also wanted to shine, and instead collapsed under the crushing weight of genetics, dynasties, and their own terrible life choices. And to keep you nice and sleepy, we're going to float slowly through it all. No drama, no cliffhangers, just a steady drift through centuries of royal dysfunction. Think of it as a guided nap with crowns. So, let's start with the obvious favorite in this little theme. The Habsburgs, or why genetics said absolutely not. The Habsburg dynasty was basically the international poster child for marry your cousin and see what happens. For hundreds of years, this family ran half of Europe. Spain, Austria, bits of Italy, the Holy Roman Empire, you name it, a Habsburg probably signed the deed. The problem was, instead of branching out into new genetic material, they doubled down on marrying each other. And not just cousins, we're talking uncles marrying nieces, first cousins on both sides, and second cousins just for variety, because apparently Tinder hadn't been invented yet. The result? Well, we get things like Charles II of Spain, known poetically as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, which makes him sound mysterious. In reality, it meant people thought he was cursed. And honestly, looking at his health record, maybe they had a point. Charles II was the final Habsburg king of Spain, and he was, genetically speaking, the equivalent of a Jenga tower with half the pieces missing. He had the famous Habsburg jaw so extreme he could barely chew food. His tongue was so large it affected his speech. He had epilepsy. He couldn't walk properly until age 8. He was infertile, and by the time he died at 38 years old, Spain just collectively sighed and said, yeah, that tracks. But here's the thing. Charles wasn't some isolated tragedy. He was the logical conclusion of a family tree that looked less like a tree and more like a wreath. Let's float back a bit. To really get why Charles ended up this way, you have to look at the family habits. For centuries, the Habsburgs had believed that marrying close relatives was the best way to keep power in the family, which, on paper, makes sense if you're terrified of outsiders stealing your land. But biologically, terrible plan. Take Philip II of Spain, Charles's great-grandfather. He married 4 times. His first wife was his cousin. His second wife was his cousin once removed. His third wife was his niece. And his fourth wife, another cousin. At this point, the family gene pool wasn't just shallow. It was evaporating. Now, Philip II is famous for sending the Spanish Armada to attack England in 1588. Spoiler, it didn't go well. But honestly, the real disaster wasn't losing ships in the English Channel. It was the way he set up his descendants to implode from the inside out. Enter Charles II. So, Charles comes along in 1661. His parents were Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, which sounds fine until you realize Mariana was his niece. So Charles was the product of an uncle-niece union, which is exactly the kind of union that makes geneticists scream into the void. Poor Charles spent his life being carted around like a fragile vase. He was technically the king, but he was so weak and ill that he couldn't rule. Ministers ran the government while Charles tried, unsuccessfully, to just survive. Everyone in Spain was waiting to see if he could produce an heir. He married twice. Both wives quickly realized this wasn't going to happen. And when Charles finally died without children in 1700, the Spanish Habsburg line just ended. Like the candle burned all the way down to nothing. And then his will, Charles basically handed Spain over to the French Bourbons, which sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, one of those endless European wars where everyone dragged in their cousins and fought over who got the crown. So in the end, Charles II's body may have failed him, but his death managed to set half the continent on fire anyway. A little star who couldn't shine. So here's where the title makes sense. Charles was a little star who desperately wanted to shine. He had all the jewels, the palaces, the robes, but none of it mattered. His own body was working against him. Imagine being raised from birth with everyone telling you you're the king of Spain, but also realizing you can't eat properly, can't have kids, and can't even speak clearly enough to inspire confidence. That's Charles, a flickering star in a family that had burned itself out by sheer stubborn inbreeding. And yet, he's fascinating because Charles II isn't just some sad figure. He's the symbol of how entire dynasties can collapse under their own weight. He is history's little reminder that power without common sense eventually leads to, well, being called the bewitched while your jaw refuses to cooperate. Let's float to Austria. But Spain wasn't the only Habsburg disaster zone. The Austrian branch of the family also had its fair share of genetic fun. Take Emperor Leopold I. He ruled Austria in the late 1600s. He was known for two things: fighting the Ottomans and having the classic Habsburg look, which meant a jawline you could trip over. Leopold wasn't the most attractive man, but he was determined to keep the dynasty going. He married 3 times. His second wife was his niece, because of course she was. The children from these marriages often didn't make it past infancy. Infant mortality was high everywhere in the 1600s, but in the Habsburg family, it was practically the house tradition. The few who survived often carried the same long jaw and the same frail health. It's like the family was playing a centuries-long experiment. How far can we push the genetics before the line collapses? And the answer was Charles II of Spain. But let's not be too harsh. It's easy to laugh at the portraits and the jawlines. It's easy to make jokes about cousin marriage and collapsing dynasties. But remember, these were real people. They lived in an age where marrying cousins wasn't just socially acceptable. It was the political strategy. If you were a royal, your options were limited to whoever shared your family crest. And yes, the results were tragic. Children who never lived past infancy. kings too sick to rule, entire empires hinging on the survival of one frail heir. But it's also part of what makes history such a strange, sad lullaby. So that's where we'll pause for now. We've drifted through the Spanish Habsburgs, met poor Charles II, and seen how one little star tried and failed to shine. In the next part, we'll float over to some equally awkward royal disasters, because Spain wasn't alone. The Bourbons, the Stuarts, the Romanovs, they all had their own bedtime tragedies. So settle in, stay cozy, and let's keep drifting.